everyone, welcome to How to Become an Influential Speaker in today's session. Can you think of an example of somebody who you think is a really powerful speaker? It could be a celebrity, it could be, it's probably not going to be a politician. We're a bit thin on the ground with good political speakers at the moment. But it could be a friend or a family member or a colleague, a boss, a manager, and have a think for a moment about why you think they are a particularly good speaker. Why is it that they communicate well? The reason that I'm asking you this is because I had a client yesterday who said to me that her boss is a really, really powerful speaker. And the reason why she wanted to do some speaking training with her team was because she wants the team to behave more like the boss. And I asked her, have you ever really stepped back and thought about what he's doing? Why is it that he's able to connect and influence the audience? Why is it that he's able to kind of get the group or a client eating out the palm of his hand? And she said, you know what? I've never even thought about doing that. I've never stepped back and really observed. And I said, well, think about it. Is it his body language? Is he using humor? Is he asking questions? And so that's really the starting point of where I want to take the workshop today. It's the first tip or strategy that I have for you. Become a really good observer. When you see somebody speaking or communicating well, actually stop and think, what are they doing? What is it that enables them to be influential? Because in my experience, there are 3 types of speaking, and that's where I want to kick us off today. Quick intro, I'm Alex Barker, and I run a program called Pass the Mic, which helps women to become influential speakers. And I've used this word influential really, really deliberately because it's the foundation of everything that underpins my approach to speaking. Because I've seen different styles of speaking over the years, and it's influence that really matters. And it's influence that we really want, if we're honest. But what typically happens when we are working in a professional environment, that we start with speaking to inform. I tend to differentiate between speaking to inform, speaking to perform, and speaking to influence. And it's speaking to inform that most of us tend to do instinctively. And that's partly because of the way that we have been primed to speak through our workplaces. We tend to overly rely on information and content. I have been to so many conferences where people pile reams of information into their slides, because they hope that this is what will give you legitimacy in front of an audience, and this is what matters more, giving people data, facts, and generally information. We tend to put information before emotion. And it has some benefit, but I often notice that it doesn't work for what we really want to happen. And what we really want to happen when we're speaking is for people to take action off the back of it. So we tend to get stuck in speaking to inform. The second type of speaking I see is speaking to perform, which is where we focus more on body language and the performative aspects of speaking, tone of voice. This is where you see people really slowing down their speaking, trying to speak with gravitas. And that's a skill that can be learnt, and it has some benefits as well, but it can very, very easily slide into being inauthentic and performative, where you feel like this person sounds good, but I'm not quite sure why I'm not connecting with them. And, that's obviously what a lot of actors rely on as well. Where we want to be, and where I will focus our session today, is speaking to have influence, which is all about connection. That's all it is. It's figuring out the ways in which you can connect with the audience, because once you connect, then you will be able to persuade and influence. And that is an inside-out job. And that's what people don't realize. So much presenting training that we get focuses on the outside in. We tend to start with thinking about, what does the audience want? What do they want to hear? What do they need from me? Instead of thinking, what is it that I want to say here? And we'll come back to why that's important shortly. But I want to start by telling you how I got into this and how I started to land on these conclusions around speaking to influence and why it's been so important in my life and my career journey. So I'll take you back to late 2018, when I landed upon the most unusual job advertisement that I have ever seen in my life for a right-hand pirate. That was the genuine title that I saw on LinkedIn. And the job itself was to work alongside this guy. This is Sam Conniff. He is the author of the best-selling book, Be More Pirate. And I read this job description for right-hand pirate, and I don't know, I was at a crossroads in my life, and I instinctively felt that this was the right thing to pursue, to follow. The job itself was a hybrid between an executive assistant, so really in the realm of you guys, and a community manager. What had happened was that off the back of a couple of publicity stunts that Sam had pulled, he had gotten so much traction with this book that people were writing to him all the time, and companies were interested. And he thought, this is something bigger than a book here. I think I want to turn it into a consultancy and training company, and also a kind of network or social movement of sorts. But he didn't really have a clue about quite where he wanted to take it. So my job was to come on board and help him figure that out. And the book itself is about being bolder, being braver, and challenging the status quo, in a nutshell. And there's a pirate, the pirate history is woven through the book. So I'll add first that the job description itself, I mean, I could see that my skills and experience really fitted that. I've done network building, I had loads of comms experience, I've done a bit of assisting before. So I thought, this is great. There was nothing about public speaking in the job description. Not at all. So when I say I'm a public speaker now, it was completely accidental. I was totally thrown in the deep end here. But what happened when I started the job was I would accompany Sam to talks, because he was giving talks 6 times a week often. Loads of companies and conferences were inviting him to get up and talk about the book and inspire the audience. And so I would go along. And what happened was astonishing to me. What I noticed was that the ideas, the key messages in the book, really were not rocket science, if I'm honest. They were quite simple but recycled wisdom that had been put into a new context and a new package. But the crowds were going mad for it. We would get emails and messages in the weeks after where people would say, you know, this was exactly what I needed to hear this today. This is like blown my mind. And I would start responding to these people. And I kind of couldn't understand what was happening here, because, you know, I'd been taught in the realm of speaking to inform, where I thought, if I'm going to get up and speak to an audience, I need to share new information, things that they wouldn't have heard before. And actually, Sam wasn't doing that, really. And I realised that it was his energy that was the key element of the presentation that was working, that was ensuring that the messages landed with the audience. And this is what informed the principle that underpins my entire approach to speaking, and is the most important thing. If you could take away anything from this, it's this. It's my North Star of speaking, which is that your energy is more important than your message. And as I said, this can feel really counterintuitive, because we're so used to relying on our slides and our content. We think that that's what gives us legitimacy and expertise. And it does, and I'm not saying that content isn't important. We'll get to that later. But this is the first thing. And, you know, it comes down to the fact that at the end of the day, we're animals. We respond to each other in a biological way first. So when you meet somebody new, you are ultimately sensing and sussing out, is this person trustworthy? Do I like them? Should they be part of my tribe? And when somebody's energy is off, you always know. I mean, passive aggressiveness is one of the most horrible experiences that we have, because words and energy are misaligned. You're hearing one thing and you're sensing another. And this happens all the time in speaking. And it's one of the reasons why people's messages don't land very well, because their energy and words are misaligned. So it can happen with, I mean, the most common is nerves, right? When you're nervous and you're trying to project confidence through your words, people are like, not quite getting this. Equally, you can be distracted and bored, or you can, just bored or distracted by something else going on at the same time. And that means that, again, your content doesn't land. So what we will do is align your energy with your words. But the first and most important thing you have to do is understand your energy better. And most of us don't look at our lives through the lens of energy. This was something that I had to do and shift to when I started public speaking. I was really used to doing what everybody does, which is assess my life based on time. Do I have enough time to do this? All these things on my to-do list. Not, do I have enough energy to make the things I need to do good quality? But when I started speaking, like if I stood up and it was, my energy wasn't there, my God, did the talk not work. So I had to shift that completely. And the way that I work and I did this for myself, and I also get all my client groups to do this, is to do an energy audit as the starting point. So this is basically like a kind of like financial audit. It's an assessment of the input and the output. What is boosting my energy and what is draining it? What I call drainers and boosters. And these can span lots of different areas. I generally suggest thinking of it in 4 categories: the people that surround you, the environments that you're in, the activities that you do regularly, and the content that you consume. And the content is something I'm going to come back to a bit later, because content is often the key thing that influences the story that you end up telling yourself. It's what informs our kind of narrative about what's happening in the world. Where is my place in the world? Am I good enough? So really watching content that you consume is important. But we'll come back to that. So looking at those 4 categories, and then once you've mapped out the kind of things that you think are really boosting your energy and draining it. And when I say this, I'd like you to go beyond what is common to everybody. So not just talking about the things we all know we have to look at, getting a decent amount of sleep and eating well. Think about what is specific to you and your circumstances and your personality. And then once you've got a bit of a map of that, just see if you can remove or add in one small thing. I always work with marginal gains theory, sort of like add the 1% per week, because that's just easier. Most of us are too busy, and it's simple, small adjustments that will make the difference. We often underestimate how big a difference a small thing can make. I always have a dance or something before I talk. I always put music on because music's a huge booster for me. So have a think, first of all, about your energy. What is the quality of your energy day to day, and how could you change that? So picking back up on my story here, I'd started to notice that Sam was really, really good at putting energy into his talks. And what I noticed was it was the passion that he had behind the key ideas, even though they were simple. And because he was so good, we kept on getting more and more interest. So I would see messages like this on social media all the time, and we still get them to this day. We get tons and tons of people saying, I absolutely love the messages. I'm starting a new business off the back of this, and all kinds of things. And so Sam was starting to get even more demand for talks, and it was starting to get clashes. He would be off abroad giving a talk, and there started to be opportunities for me to potentially talk, or, we started to discuss that. There was a couple of occasions where I'd stood up spontaneously in an event we had to share a bit more about my role in it all. And Sam, I think, had picked up on that and gone, you could probably do this too. And then one day, he put me forward for a really big event for... it was an event in the UK that was a huge corporate client, about 150 people in the audience, and it had also a hefty fee attached. And he kind of did it without me really knowing. And afterwards he said, look, I don't know if they'll go for it, but if they go for it, I hope you're up for it. And I was like, dude, how do you know I can even do this? You've never really seen me give a big talk or anything. And he just said to me, I don't think you'll let yourself fail, which I thought was cheeky, but also very in keeping with our pirate message. And one of our key mantras, I guess, is start before you're ready. So I started before I was ready, or I felt ready. And I had no idea how to approach putting together a talk at all, because I'd never done it. And so I did the only thing that I thought I should, which was to simply learn the talk that Sam had given so many times, because we knew that it was good. We knew that it was tried and tested, and I didn't want to mess with the content. So I just rehearsed, kind of word for word what he said, and got to the day of the talk and basically regurgitated that. And this is me, not the talk itself. This is one of my early talks. It's actually in Macedonia. And I was nervous. And on the day of that particular talk, I felt pleased that I didn't, fluff the lines, I didn't freeze or faint, but it wasn't good. It wasn't good because I didn't get the same reaction to the content. The audience didn't laugh at the pirate puns I added, and they didn't seem to respond to the really strong, serious messages that we had either. And so I walked away feeling really flat and thinking, well, where did I go wrong here? Because I said the exact same things. But I hadn't understood at this point what speaking to influence was about. So because I had some more talks coming up, I decided to take some advice and I hired a really, really good public speaking coach called Caroline Goyder. Really recommend looking at some of her stuff. She's got a couple of great books. And I was very lucky to get a session with her. But the first question that she asked me when we did this completely floored me. I had no idea. I thought that she would help me work on my delivery. I thought, the content was done, in my opinion. So I thought she'd just, make me more charming and funnier. But the first thing that she asked me was this: what do you believe about this? And honestly, I didn't understand the question to begin with. I was like, well, what do you mean? Like, I believe about what exactly? About how good I am? And she said, no, what do you believe about your topic? About rule breaking, about pirates? And I was like, oh, good question. And she went on to explain that the reason why my talk was not landing was because none of the ideas, the revelations and the examples in it were mine. They were all Sam's. And this is what gives you legitimacy and power in front of an audience. This is how you align your energy with your words, when you can find the conviction in the points. And honestly, this was a penny drop moment to me. I had no idea that it was because nothing in the talk had come from me. And this is what I mean about speaking being an inside-out job. None of it had come from my own discoveries, my own revelations. So they didn't carry the same energy. Even if I agreed with what Sam was saying, it was not on the same level at all. And so what she did with me was something I call a belief brainstorm. For the next hour of that session, brainstormed all of my original ideas about what it meant to break the rules. And I realized through that I had a completely different idea about this to Sam, because we were coming from quite different places in life. And actually, as I was going through it, you could see my energy lift about 100%, because I was like, yes, wow, that really matters. That's really important. And suddenly we almost had a whole new talk. Within the skeleton of the pirate story, I was able to insert my own examples, my own revelations. And I could see how this was going to completely change the game and give it power. And that is what I've been doing ever since then. And I credit this for how I've been able to be a paid public speaker. So that's the second thing I always do with my groups, a belief brainstorm. Take your topic, choose a topic to begin with, and then ask yourself, what do I believe about this? And the key is, what do I believe? Not what does my company believe? What does my manager believe? What does the world sort of think about this? What does the Harvard Business Review say about this topic? What do you believe? And it can be quite difficult, but it's the starting point. And I have prompt questions that I always ask people, to get them started and trigger some ideas. How has this topic affected you personally? Why does this topic matter in the world at large? So if we were taking the idea of being an executive assistant, like, what does an executive assistant bring to a company? And sort of start from there. But this alone is not enough to get you to the point of being an influential speaker. Having some key opinions and ideas is really, really important because they carry conviction. But there is a follow-up question that you must ask next, which is how did you arrive at this belief? I was going to say, why do you believe this? But how did you arrive here? And I really believe that we're in a space in the world at the moment where we're getting so much polarization and division in discourse, in public discourse. It's really damaging. And part of the reason for that is because we've become so focused on the opinion that someone holds and not how they arrived there, when actually this is by far the most interesting part. If you can show people how you arrive somewhere, you create connection because you invite them into your experience. It's like when we're at school and you would get points on a maths test, right, if you could show your workings out. So show your workings out. And even if the audience doesn't agree with your conclusion, you'll find that you've created a connection anyway, which is the point of influence. And this is also about leading with curiosity. This is the key energy that I always ask my groups to try and tap into, to try and think of yourself not as an expert when you're speaking, but as an explorer. Your job is to not have all the answers about your topic, because nobody has all the answers. Your job is to show what you've seen and what you've learned along the way and ask them, what do you think? Does this resonate? Because influencing happens not by demanding, not by doing the Trumpian-esque kind of steamrollering people into submission, but by inviting them in and asking them to consider new possibilities that maybe they just not thought of before. So curiosity is the key. And the place that I start when I'm doing this as an exercise to get you into understanding how you arrive somewhere is to do something called a timeline exercise. So I've given an example here. One of my core beliefs is leadership as a behavior, not a title. So what I did was I drew a timeline, actually a physical timeline, to think through all the, well, not all, but many of the experiences that I'd had around leadership that had allowed me to come to this conclusion: the good, the bad, and the ugly. So not just looking at leadership when it's good, but also looking at leadership when it was bad. And what I understood from seeing those, going through those experiences was, yes, there are times when I've been in groups of people where the person who doesn't have the title has actually exhibited greater leadership than the person at the top of the food chain. And then I would look at, well, what were they doing? What was the behaviors that they were exhibiting that made me look to them as a leader? And equally, when I've, had previous managers or CEOs who, for me, have not acted like a leader, what were they doing? How were they shying away from leadership? So that's the first point, to start to map out your experiences. And they can be big experiences and they can just be small moments or situations that you've been in. But the goal with this exercise is to try to then turn some of the experiences that you've identified into stories, because stories are, again, we're talking influence, are a way to create connection with an audience. We all know this. We absorb information far better through stories than through data or graphs or any kind of more objective format. So we want to be able to have in our back pocket at all times a series of interesting and emotionally resonant anecdotes around our topic area that we can pull out in all kinds of situations, whether it's a job interview or a chance run-in with a client, so that you can always offer them a story about your topic. And the next stage of this, the way that I use a very, very simple storytelling structure to begin with to help you start to shape what is just a kind of random memory into a story. And again, it's something that I've nicked from Caroline Goyder, but I found it really powerful. It's something called identifying the transforming insight. So within your story, you want to find that moment of revelation, that moment that made you realize something. In my case, I'm talking about the moment that made me realize, leadership is not a title. And really what's powerful about this is that a story with a transforming insight is where your personal lived experience meets the overall subject matter you're talking about, and you get a revelation. And the reason this is important is because, again, the number one thing that women say to me when they want to have speaking coaching is, I just have imposter syndrome, or I just don't feel like I'm expert enough. If I ask them what they're most afraid of, it is that the audience will judge that I don't know enough. And what I'm trying to do, and what this exercise reframes, is that your lived experience is the key. This is what creates connection, and connection is what creates influence. And context really matters. As I said at the beginning with Sam's talk, he was just recycling established wisdom and putting it into a different context. And it was the context and combined with his conviction that made the messages really, really work and land with the audience. It's often when people put it into a particular context that resonates with us that we suddenly get that moment of, yeah, this makes sense now, whereas it might not have made sense before. So never ever underestimate the power of your lived experience. You don't need to be an expert in a subject. You need to show people what you have learned and understood. And I'll give a really, really quick example of this. So a story that I often tell around leadership, and it's not a particularly big story, but it was one of the first ones that I came up with when I mapped out leadership on the timeline. One of the most significant examples of leadership that I can remember from when I was at school was my GCSE history teacher, Mr. Radway. And the reason why he was I looked up to him so much as a teacher and as a leader was because he had a way of talking about historical events as if they were chapters in a story, almost like he would leave us at the end of class on a cliffhanger, which was a very, very clever strategy to get a group of 15-year-olds to want to come back to class. And so we went through all of American history in this really episodic way. And I felt like he was this grand keeper of history. And so after I'd completed GCSEs, I went into the A-levels, and he had an A-level politics class, so I immediately signed up. But I remember this one moment in one of our politics classes, and bear in mind I really trusted Mr. Radway because I'd gone through this, had such a great experience with him in the previous year. He said to us, "I don't think we will ever see a black president, not in your lifetimes." And I remember that moment so clearly, and I remember feeling how tragic it was because we just studied the whole of the civil rights movement. But, I trusted him completely. I trusted his analysis and I trusted his insights. So I took him at his word. Fast forward, a few years later, I'm at university. I was at university, and I'm watching the news as President Obama becomes elected. And this moment always gives me goosebumps because I remember the revelation that came with it. And we were about 2 years into having Facebook at that point, I think. And so I tried looking up Mr. Radway online to see if I could send him a message to say, "You were wrong. We're going to have a black president." And it taught me in that moment 2 really critical things. First, that a leader can be brilliant, wise, insightful, kind and empathetic, and also still get some things completely wrong. And it taught me that seismic positive shifts are possible in my lifetime. The things that we are told are impossible aren't necessarily. And those 2 ideas have stayed with me throughout my life, and they really inform a lot of the work that I do with Be More Pirate. So, stepping back from that is an example of a short story, imperfectly told, but one I often do tell about how I see leadership and a leadership revelation that came to me from doing that timeline exercise. So you can take all kinds of things. They might be school, they might be workplace, they might be personal, and just see what you come up with. So that's what I'm gonna finish off there with content, the content side of things, because it would be remiss of me to not tackle another subject in this talk, particularly as I've said so much about how important energy is. I want to now spend the last part of the session talking about dealing with fear, because I know so many people find public speaking to be the scariest thing that they could possibly be asked to do. So the first thing is I don't believe in the word fearless. I don't think that's possible. Fear is a biological function inbuilt into our brains for a good reason, and we're never going to get rid of it. So we can forget that idea. What you can do is change your relationship with it. You can dial it down in certain moments. And the only way I find that you can really dial down fear is by getting a bit closer to it, understanding it more. So I'm going to come back to that point in a minute, but there are essentially 4 ways that I want to talk about how you can address fear when it comes to speaking. 4 ways that I address in my program as well. Conviction, regulation, exposure therapy, and identity. So conviction we've already covered, really. Conviction is about the fact that your confidence will naturally rise once you tap into your beliefs about a subject. Because quite often the reason we're nervous when we're speaking is because we don't know we actually don't know what we believe in. So we're worried that someone's going to pick us up on it because we haven't done the deep work of going, why do I believe this? Where did it come from? Can I back it up? We're often, as I said, absorbing and regurgitating what other people have said. So conviction is the first thing. Secondly, regulation. Recognizing that fear ultimately lives in your body. There is an element of nervous system regulation that needs to go on here. I do a little bit of this in Pass the Mic, not as much as you can do. I find that nervous system regulation is quite a personal thing to get into. So my suggestion is usually that you look at different techniques and you work on this privately. For most people, some degree of breath work is helpful. I have an exercise in the course where we look at breath, because breath is the link right between our brains and our bodies and our mouths. And obviously that's where speaking happens. So it is important to think about your breath and how you can use it more effectively. Movement is also important because, as I said, if it lives in the body, like shaking the energy out of your body, going for walks before you talk. I often ask people to think about the questions that I give them on a walk. Also expression in itself regulates your nervous systems. Writing in a journal or talking out loud. I send a lot of voice notes to myself, which not many people admit. Talking to yourself used to be a sign of madness, but I often say a lot of things out loud to myself to see how it sounds and to see what my comfortability with saying it is. I would certainly suggest doing that. And I would move, once you've started getting comfortable with sending yourself little memos and voice notes, see if you can start to do that to 1 or 2 close friends if you don't already. I'm a big advocate of voice notes. I know not everyone likes them or likes receiving them, but find a couple of people that are okay with it and start to voice your ideas to them as well. And this is where we get into exposure therapy, because exposure therapy is about acclimatizing your nervous system to being visible. And it would be completely dishonest of me to say that the main reason why I don't have any nerves speaking now is because I've done it so many times. I think it was about 2 years in where all the nerves suddenly dropped and I was fine on a stage. And that's quite a lot of repetition. And the problem is that we don't tend to get that kind of repetition. So you have to actively and intentionally create it for yourself if you want to get better at this. There is no route around this. You can't circumvent it. You are going to have the first few talks that you do probably not going very well. And what the big barrier that happens is that when you have a talk that doesn't go very well, you get really stuck in the memory of that. And this leads us on to the 4th point. When you get stuck in the memory of a talk that didn't go well and you don't have the chance to get back in the arena and try again, you start to use that experience to define how you see yourself as a speaker. You get stuck in it. What happened to me was that when I had a bad talk, I would then have the opportunity to kind of course correct. And what happened was the story that I was telling myself wasn't, I'm a bad speaker. It was, I can be a good speaker, but I recognized it was under certain conditions that I was good. And under certain conditions, I wasn't so good. But it allowed me to reconfigure how I saw myself. So the formation of your identity often happens quite unconsciously around how you see yourself. And because we don't like to think about the bad moments, we tend to bury them in our minds, which means they often become these unconscious blockers. And that's why you get so many physical responses when you're speaking. You get sweaty palms and short of breath and all that. And it's because your body is trying to signal to you, this is bad, this is bad, this is going to reinforce, this is, you're not good at this is going to create some kind of threat. So you have to find a way to convince your brain that that's not the case. Doing more talks is one way, but there is another way that I've found. You can we all know this now, our brains are neuroplastic. There's a bit of neuroscience behind this. You can prime yourself to think about yourself differently, and particularly think about yourself differently as a speaker. So there's one particular exercise I advocate and I get all my groups to do. They don't always love it, I have to be honest, but I promise it's worth it. So it's an exercise around complimenting yourself. So it's really about figuring out, what story am I telling myself? Moving from that negative one to the positive one. And what you can do is go back through your inbox, or perhaps your memory will be good enough, and find a compliment that somebody has given you. And it's got to be a sincere one that you believed in. So maybe after you did a great piece of work, someone said, hey, that was amazing. Ideally around speaking, but if you can't make it around speaking, then you can pick something else that relates to your work. So find a sincere compliment that someone has given you and write it out. Write it out verbatim, exactly as they have said it to you. The second stage is rewrite it. Rewrite it in the first person. So turn it from, you were really inspiring, to, I was really inspiring, to give you an example. And this is where people, particularly British people like me, get a bit uncomfortable and find it a bit cringy, because it sounds a bit like an affirmation, which is what it is really. But this works and is important is because it's an affirmation that is based in actual evidence. Our brains find it very, very hard to change when there's no evidence. And a lot of us do have evidence of when we were good at stuff, but we don't actually pay as much attention to it because our brains prefer to seek threat instead. So we spend a lot of time worrying about things going wrong rather than identifying the times when they went right and really intentionally focusing our focus. So what I'm trying to do is get you to build a bank of evidence. So, I was really inspiring and I'm able to hold a person's attention. It could be one, but have a look through and see what you come up with. But the third and most important step is that you read it out loud. And I've put for the next 10 days because that's a good start. If you don't repeat this, it will not get embedded as a belief at all. Saying it once out loud or writing it is not enough. Our brains need to hear things on repeat, and for them to sink in and for them to actually rewire the pathway. It's much harder to form a new pathway. That we want to default to the old ones naturally. And I'm not going to go into all the neuroscience here. There's more to it, but this really works. And honestly, I'll tell you this. I did this with one of my coaches. I had a speaking coach, and then I also got a kind of mindset coach. And I learned so much from him. But he's American. And he said to me when we were doing this, he was like, "You're going to hate this as a Brit. You're so bad at taking compliments." But he made me go through this. We didn't just do compliments. We also did, I had to write out big wins that I'd had, and I had to write out ways in which people had helped me, because that also demonstrates to your brain that people value you. And then he made me do the whole process, and I was writing them out, and he was making me almost shout them. And I was like hating it. But we'd spent 2 hours doing this. And then that evening I went out for dinner with my dad, and it was a lovely summer evening in London, and we were sitting outside at this Spanish restaurant. They'd pulled all these tables out into the street. And a woman and her daughter were queuing up next to us to get a table. And they hadn't booked. And she said, "Oh, do you think we'll be able to get a table?" And my dad was like, yeah, I'm sure. They seem to pull up more chairs. It ended up that they got a table and it was right next to us. And so my dad, being of a generation, always talks to everyone. And he struck up conversation with the woman and her daughter. And what was really astonishing in this moment is this woman couldn't stop saying to me, "I just feel like really great things are going to happen to you. I just feel like you've got such a good aura. I don't know what it is, but like I'm just picking up on this." And I have to say, to this day, I often wonder if it's because I spent the whole afternoon essentially priming my brain to think about myself in a totally different way. And whether somehow that energy was translating, and that might feel a little bit woo-woo for some people, but that is a true story of what happened on that exact day. So I from there, I've always stuck to this compliments activity, and I keep a compliments bank, and I'm really, really particular about making sure that even when things go wrong, I'm like, okay, that didn't go as well as I wanted it to, but it's not the only story here. And there's a really great talk, if I was to give you an example of a great talk to listen to, it's The Danger of a Single Story. And this is so true. You can look it up online, it's a TEDx talk. And we should never attach ourselves to a single story in the world or about ourselves. So work on the story that you're telling yourself. That's, I think, one of the key and most significant ways you can dial down fear. So I'm going to wrap it up there and see if there's questions. But I want to just finish by saying, if you're interested in doing the full course that I run, Pass the Mic, and there's a couple of options, and I've just put a QR code up here in case anyone wants to have a look. All the info is on my website. There are 2 versions. You can do a live cohort of 7 weeks in a small group of around 6 to 8 women, and each week you get a chance to practice. And this is really about this idea of getting into the arena and giving yourself that exposure therapy with a very supportive group of women who are all in the same boat. And that's a whole 7-week program, and the next one starts in September. Or you can take Pass the Mic on demand, which is basically a self-paced online course, and you can do that straight away. But within that, because I think, we can all get sidetracked when we have to do things on our own, I have built in some accountability. You have the option to get some personalized feedback. You can send me a video or an audio recording of yourself. And you can also get 30% off a one-to-one coaching session at any point in the course if you want to go a bit deeper with that. So with that, I will leave it there and come back into the room. Thank you very much. I hope this was helpful.